Welcome to Angela's Pantry Obsession. I'm Angela, and today we're in the kitchen. I'm canning peach salsa just in time for the winter. I'm going to start by getting my peppers and onions chopped up. I love using this mini slicer when I have a smaller project, but more than just a couple things to chop. So I've got some red onions, jalapenos, and green bell peppers chopped up in my chopper, and I'm going to get a couple cloves of garlic in there as well. I like to have my vegetables diced up rather small for my peach salsa, but you can decide whichever size you want for your salsa. Now, peach salsa, you do want to have the skins removed, and the easiest way to do this is by blanching your peaches. Bring a boiling pot of boiling water up to boil, drop your peaches in, and it just needs to be in there for but maybe a minute. Plunge the peaches into cold water to immediately stop any cooking that may have started to occur. And that skin should just come off without any effort. And then you're going to remove the skins from all of your peaches. This is probably the hardest part of the whole process, which it's not even difficult. It's just maybe a little time consuming. So if you've got teenagers or young ones who like being in the kitchen with you, this could be a good project for them. Once the skins are removed, you can decide to slice and dice each peach, but I would suggest that you put them in a bowl with some vinegar to make sure that your peaches do not start to brown. I prefer to remove the skin and slice my peaches at the very end. I'll show you here in a little bit what I do to break up my peaches. I do not go a step further to then dice all of them. They break apart later on, so I don't worry about that for now. We're going to get our brine ready, so I'm going to measure out my vinegar. For this salsa recipe, you do want to use a vinegar that is 5% acidity. We're going to get the peaches then dumped into the pot as well. And behind me on my stove, next to the big pot where I blanched my peaches, I have my pressure canner set up. This is not a pressure canning recipe. However, I do use the pressure canner at times for a water bath canner. So I have my jars sitting in my canner filled with water, and I have my jars sitting at just a low simmer. I want my jars to be sterilized and hot when I'm ready to put everything into a jar. So next I'm going to get all of the peppers and onions and that little bit of garlic. I'm going to throw those into the pot with the peaches and the vinegar. You can go ahead and have your stovetop at a simmer. Eventually, we will crank up the heat to bring it to a boil, but just to get things kind of started, you can have it at a simmer. Once we have all of our produce added into the pot, we're going to go ahead and get some of the herbs and spices in there. So I'm going to use my freeze-dried cilantro. If there's anything I wish I could grow all season long and have an abundance of, it would be cilantro. And I know that's one of those herbs that people really either love or hate, but I happen to really love cilantro. I didn't have any fresh on hand, so I'm just going to go ahead and use my freeze-dried. It'll work just as well. Then this recipe calls for honey. Now, you do not have to add a sweetener. If you can't use honey, you can just use a regular sugar, or you could even use a sugar substitute. The sugar in this recipe is to help offset some of that vinegar taste as well as some of the heat that we're putting in there from the jalapenos, but it can be skipped. Sweeteners in a canning recipe bears no effect on the preservation and safety of what we're canning. We don't preserve with sugar. It's just for flavor, just the same as salt. So use whatever sweetener your family likes best. I do happen to really love the honey in this recipe, so I just use what it calls for, but I make sure to use every last bit of that honey because it's expensive. We're going to get the spices next, and this recipe does call for cumin. It really helps to sort of develop all of the flavors that go on in this salsa. If you don't like cumin, you could leave it out and maybe play around with some other flavors that you like. And then it also calls for cayenne pepper. You can definitely leave this out, especially if you feel like you've received enough heat from the jalapenos, but I added just a little bit of it. And so here it is all in the pot. You can see that it's kind of dry right now. It's mostly those peaches that have not been cooked down just yet, but we're going to give it all a really good stir, and we're going to crank up the heat, and we're going to get our product to a boil, and then we'll turn it down just a little. Okay, here it's been boiling for a few minutes and you can see how much liquid has released. I use my meat masher now to go in and break up those large pieces of peaches. They fall right apart, especially now that they've been heated through a little. So that's why I don't go through that extra step of dicing everything up. I throw them in sliced and I break them up later, and it works fantastic. Peaches have a little bit of natural pectin as well, and so you'll notice that your liquid does start to become a little bit more like a syrup, and that helps to create that really good thick consistency, and it is so good. Removing the hot sanitized jars from my canner, I emptied the water. If you're new at canning, you might want to only work with one jar at a time, just so your other jars don't cool down too much. We don't want cold jars going back into a hot canner. That will create shock and your jars could bust. I tend to move rather quickly, so I work on 3 jars at a time. We're going to fill the jars up to a 1/2 inch headspace. There is a special tool that you can buy in a whole package when you first begin canning that has an end that will help you to measure what your headspace is. So I do recommend that as a new canner. 1 inch headspace is pretty much right at the neck of that jar. And so then another 1/2 inch up, of course, would be a 1/2 inch headspace. We're going to get all of those added in, and then we will debubble what we put in there. Debubbling helps to remove any air pockets that is in our jar. We do not want air pockets that can trap air, and once that jar is sealed, that could potentially be a good environment for bacteria and botulism to grow. So that's why we put any sort of thin spatula or chopstick. You can purchase a debubbler. Whatever you use, just make sure you run it down the sides of your jars, release any air pockets, add more product if your headspace changes, and then always wipe your rims. I use a rag in vinegar. Vinegar helps to cut through any grease, oil, and then, of course, it removes all of the food product that could be interrupting a good seal later on. Go ahead and place your lid on with your ring, fingertip tight, and it's ready to go into the water bath. It just looks so pretty, doesn't it? And it tastes really good as well. That's probably more important. So watch me as I do these next couple here on how I add it, and I go through the same repetitive steps each and every time. I fill, I debubble, I check my headspace again, and then I wipe the rims, place my lids and the ring, close it fingertip tight, and it's ready for my water bath canner. There was a little bit left over, so that went into the fridge. And I actually do love it when we have just a little bit left over to snack on at a later time. And it's always wise to taste it as you go to make any adjustments. So I am going to put my last jar into the canner, and I wanted to show you how I left those 4 empty jars in there. This helps to reduce the jarring of what's in there. When it comes to a full rolling boil, I don't want my jars dancing around in there, and that helps to keep everything in its place. If you're using a pressure canner, don't lock the lid in place. Just set it right on top. Today's peach salsa recipe is coming from this book, the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, and it's on page 215. I can get there. Peach salsa. I did not do any modifications. Well, I suppose the only modification I did was instead of a red bell pepper, I used 2 green bell peppers from my garden. I didn't have any red. I'm sure it probably makes it look prettier, but just use what you have on hand. And yeah, otherwise I followed the recipe exactly how it states. I did that the last time and it turned out phenomenal. I had just a little bit left over. And so I have it in this container and I will absolutely enjoy it for lunch tomorrow. So it is spicy. I used 4 jalapenos. I left the seeds and ribs in. So it has got quite a bit of heat to it. So just be mindful if you are sensitive to heat. But it's amazing. I processed my jars for 15 minutes. With my elevation, I had to add another 5 minutes, so 20 minutes. Once the timer went off, I shut my stove off and I let it come down from a boil and I let it sit there for 10 minutes. I remove my lid and I let my jars sit there for another 5 minutes. This helps my jars to acclimate to the outside temperature, my kitchen temperature, and it helps to reduce any siphoning that my jars might go through. So, siphoning is when the product is in your jar, no matter what it is. If it starts to seep out before it's made a proper seal, that's called siphoning. And a lot of times that can be avoided by helping your jars not go through a major temperature change from what's inside the canner to the temperature in your home. I will remove my jars one by one, putting them on a towel. You want a barrier between the countertop and your hot jar because, again, we don't want to introduce any major temperature changes. And a cold counter and a hot jar could make a jar crack as well. So we want to avoid that. So I got 5 pints of peach salsa to add to my pantry, and I feel so good about that. I cannot wait for it to be the middle of winter, but I'm getting the taste of summer right from a jar. Nothing is better than that. I hope I encouraged you to give your hand at canning. Salsa is a great first time canning recipe to try. There's a little bit of prep work involved, but the process itself is really quite simple. So I hope you come back the next time I'm in my pantry or my kitchen cooking for my family or canning and preserving. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.